Hi everyone, thanks for coming out to watch. I'm Lily Burns.
And I'm Farmer Jack.
And you're watching Farmer Jack and the Agvocate. On this episode, we wanted to dive a little deeper into the history of farming, like we do in every episode. Specifically, I want to talk about how farmers got to where they are today income-wise. Farmers are extremely impoverished. It's a very hard job, but not a lot of income comes from it. Farmers are in poverty. How did we get from, we've talked about farmers in World War I had this oversupply of food, over surplus of food. How did we get from there to where farmers are today?
Yeah, that's a great question. Just quick reference. The median income for farmers in 2024 was negative $1,800 that's for on-farm income.
Wow.
Yeah, so the way it really stands right now, I think it's like 85% of all farmers have two jobs. And this is primarily because the farming just doesn't make enough money for any kind of living. Why I say that is because there was a time period in history where that was not true for the farmers. But we have to go back a ways. That was kind of one of the challenges I took upon myself, was trying to determine, was there ever a time in American history that farming made money? And if we look back about 100 years ago, from about 1900 to about 1914, we have what's called the golden age of farming. And during this period, farmers were kind of finally getting to a place of, if you want to call it prestige. They weren't looked down upon. The communities really focused in and said, hey, this is an important thing that we're doing. So much so that the farmers were sending their sons and their daughters to big colleges to learn just simple economics, bookkeeping, all these different traits of how to run a successful business, and coming back to the farm to implement these things. Where in the past, they had been exporting their kids, for lack of better terms. They were sending their kids to the city to make a better living. And so from this, we went from a time of great wealth for farmers to about 26-month window that went from good to bad in an accelerated time. And when I say bad, I mean really bad.
Uh-oh.
Uh-oh.
That's not good. Really bad is not good. How do we go from that, what you said, the golden age of farming, how do we get from there kind of transitioning into the area of poverty that we are now? Was there something that kind of accelerated that? Was there something that really heavily influenced that?
Yeah.
Anything in particular?
Yeah. Market intervention, number one. So if we look back at this golden age time period, we have to understand that was the last true time in American history that supply and demand, without anybody else mingling in on in the system. So what I mean by that is there was no government agencies controlling prices. There was no government agencies telling the farmers how much they have to grow. There wasn't an expectation of the product, the food they sell, being at a low value. People were understood at that time period. It was an exchange. If I have to work a job to have enough money to buy the food, I accept that and I'll do that, right? So it wasn't that I just should get the food for nothing. Not an expectation, not an entitlement. So to get to that point though, and in that short time period, we had the government under Wilson, George Creel, Edward Bernays, under a CPI, was a program they used most of this influence on, and they propagandized the farmer and the rest of your urban cities, your rural communities. Whether it was newspapers, they went to schools, they had kids write the pledge saying that they wouldn't eat too much product. And the idea became that the patriotism aspect was really the hard push, that it was the patriotic duty of the farmers, to produce as much food in a short amount of time for the least amount of cost for the Allies.
That's a heavy weight for all those farmers to bear, having to not only provide for their families, but for the communities and the nation. With that patriotism comes a great weight, I'm assuming. That must have not been easy for a lot of farmers.
Yeah, it wasn't easy for a lot of them. And there was a lot of them that were just absolutely not having it. It wasn't just something that they wholeheartedly accepted. There was a lot of resistance. We see a lot of farmer revolts actually in this time period. And you see the government even take another step farther And, under Wilson, you end up having like the Espionage Act and the Sedition Act, and they use these mechanisms to suppress the voice of the farmer even more. They went as far as put a lot of them in prison. They put a lot of pressure on communities there with like the 4 Minute Men talking about how, being anti-war was anti-patriotic. At the same time, they were telling the farmers that them creating as much abundance of food as they can was their patriotic duty. So you see how these two conflicting issues. So it was this huge pressure campaign for farmers to do this. And little by little, as it started, the dissenters got silenced and they didn't have a voice. And so as that goes, you see farmers just buy in more and more and more. They understood that, they didn't really have a choice. There's some liberty bonds and some stuff we might be talking a different time about, but it really didn't give them a choice to kind of really exercise their freedom of their voice, number one, or any kind of, personal decision that's best for their family even at that time. So, and then the government comes in and controls prices, right? They said prices can only be this much through the AAA and some other programs. So it went from bad to worse. It went from golden age to government making these guys farm as much as they could to supply as much food as possible to the Allies, to the government then coming in and suppressing the prices of everything. So, because they didn't want the regular population to, uprise either. They didn't put a price stop, so the product just was devalued. So it starts a cycle. Anyways, go ahead.
So, did the farmers, was there ever a point in history from where they obviously made them increase surplus, but then made them sell it for a lower price like we talked about in our last episode? Was there a time between then and where we have farmers today, did they ever recover at all from their voices being suppressed? Was there ever any uprisings of the farmer's voice in farmer unions? Or are they still kind of at that level today?
Yeah, I think it's there has been some small instances where the farmers did try to get a collective voice and say something, but most immediately it was shut down. Here's the thing you have to think about. If you have farmers making a low wage and having a product they're producing that 3 times a day most people are eating, you would think they would have leverage to get a livable wage. You think that they would be able to have a voice that they could be collectively like, hey, we need more money. Historically, right? We gotta go back. Remember, farms are passed down generation after generation after generation. So what a lot of farmers hear are, unions don't work, farmer unions don't work, nobody's ever going to speak out for the farmer. It's just us as a small community for ourselves. Because we've not had a voice. And the government 100 years ago was throwing farmers in jail. So the AWO was really the only representation that the farmers had. That was kind of the big one. There was a few other small.
What does that stand for again?
Agriculture Workers Organization,
okay.
Right. And it was under IWW. So the amount of agriculture workers in IWW was huge. I think it was like at the time that this was going on was almost like 70% or 80%. Okay. So it was, heavily agriculture workers. Mm-hmm. That's where you see the Sedition Act. You just see this major pressure from the government to come in and suppress these things. They went through all their records, and there was lynchings, there was, farmers attacked, there was farmers tarred and feathered.
Goodness gracious. It's awful.
Yeah, it was. But it set a precedence for, I believe it set a precedence for 100 years is why you don't see farmer organizations actually speaking up for the farmer, or the farmer thinking that that their voice is being heard, or even stepping up and saying, we need a group and organization that can, make our voices be heard. It's because they've lost faith that that's even a possibility from the suppression.
Mm-hmm.